Thank you, Abhishek, and hello, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm Leigh Gallagher, as Abhishek said, and I'm thrilled to be here with our two wonderful speakers. I'm also a Cornell graduate, so I haven't been here yet before. It's really incredible to be here. So, how do we begin? We've just spent the morning talking about TradFi, traditional finance. Hearing from, just talking about all those topics, and now we're going to talk about trad tech, traditional tech. What does Google think about crypto and blockchain? What does Microsoft think? What is the perspective of these large established companies? And where are we in Web3's evolution as well? I'm going to let our speakers introduce themselves, but I will tell you who they are. To my left is Rich Widmann, Global Head of Strategy for Web3 at Google Cloud, where he co-founded Google's Web3 efforts and oversees the execution of Google Cloud's Web3 product roadmap. He's also a lawyer with a lot of experience in blockchain and crypto and an adjunct professor at the Northwestern University School of Law. Yorke Rhodes, to his left, or stage right, is Director of Strategy and Transformation Traceability at Microsoft, and which sits within the Cloud Hardware Supply Chain Group, and he is co-founder of blockchain at Microsoft. Yorke's career goes back to the early days of personal computing and Windows, and he's also held critical roles at wireless internet startups and leadership roles at Goldman and IBM, and he also teaches at NYU. So I'd like to, and Neil wanted me to introduce myself a little bit, just so you have why I'm up here. I am a longtime former journalist at Fortune and elsewhere. Author of a few books, including one about Airbnb, so I have studied innovation and talked to a lot of founders about disrupting technology. And now I'm in communications, spent a few years at Google, and now I'm at a CEO advisory firm called Teneo, where I help companies think through challenges and hone in their communication strategies, including some crypto companies. So with that, let's get started. Rich, why don't you tell us who you are?
Yeah, so I won't go over the intro points that you made. I think that's a bit redundant, but maybe I'll just talk to you about what my job is, right? As somebody who leads a crypto team within a large company, I think that sounds a little bit nascent to most folks. If I said, hey, I'm running strategy and I work at a crypto company, everyone kind of knows what that means if I'm at a stablecoin provider or an exchange. But at Google, it's really an interesting opportunity because the way that I view my role within the company, and Yorke, I'm curious to get your view on sort of how you would define yours, but it's really about driving the ball forward as it relates to Google and crypto every single day. And whether that's the product strategy and thinking about, where does Google have a natural right to win? And then how do we bring those skills and capabilities into this new market? Whether it's changing Google's surface area exposure to crypto. We've talked a lot about the work that we have been doing as a company in terms of adoption and piloting of stablecoins. And then whether it's just also broadly educating the company about the promise of this frontier technology. Instead of having this either or mindset of new tech and old tech, really thinking about how these things blend together and become complementary. And so that's what I spend most of my day doing. It's a bit of teaching, it's a bit of advocacy, and then it's a little bit of that product development and strategy.
Great. Yorke, how about you?
I'm going to take a little bit of a different take. The qualities that sort of drove me to where I am today are, one, curiosity and disruption. And if you're in the tech space, that means you're sort of on every tech wave every 8 to 10 years. And if you look at my career, that's basically what happened. And I didn't actually realize that until about halfway through. And then I was very deliberate, actually, when I went back to Microsoft in 2014 to learn cloud. By the way, I had to convince the recruiter that they shouldn't give me a test on cloud because I would fail it. Anyway, so they hired me. And about 6 months after that, I sort of fell down the blockchain rabbit hole, and I was like, oh, crap, what do I do now? And so this was early 2015 at this point. My thinking about this was like, how have I done this type of disruption in other categories? How do I think about this from a startup perspective inside of an ecosystem? And that's exactly how I took this lens. I know something that nobody else knows. I'm sitting in a very large centralized company. I need to educate, to your point. I need to cajole. I need to push the boundaries of. And just side data point, we shipped Visual Studio plugin in April of 2016, about 3 months after we sort of formally decided we're going to go on this journey in the context of my first role at Microsoft, which was focusing on partners. And that was after I basically shifted all of my partner work into the blockchain ecosystem. So that was actually a pretty easy shift for me. And the other context that I think I want to give is large companies are not a monolith. Large companies are many things. And so many things means you have many people who make their own decisions, right? And Microsoft, I think, is 24 divisions, including LinkedIn and GitHub, and many different product teams. And every product team makes their own choice about what makes sense for their business at any point in time. And so I would say AI is different because from an AI perspective, AI will be a utility in everything, and everyone can see that. And so that's a push that you can see that's a different push than we saw sort of in the early days of Web3 and blockchain and these concepts.
That's great. So I want to talk about a couple things, including I really want to ask you both about innovating within large companies. I mean, that is really, there's so much you have to share about that. But before we talk about that, let's talk about where we are in the evolution of Web3. What would you say is a comparable phase in Web1 or Web2? Rich, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think probably where we're at is, at the time before Google search, right? In sort of the first Web 1 world where, a lot of searching the web wasn't searching, it was getting a recommendation from a friend about a new website, and you had to type in the domain name, and you had to know the domain, and if you forgot the domain, you're just like, what is that, and how do I go find it again? And that's why I think MapQuest was around then, right? So people I used MapQuest a lot as a kid to help my parents get directions. And
Anybody remember this? Probably a lot of
yeah.
people don't. Okay.
Yeah, this is like before you had mobile, right?
Right.
So it's sort of like, if you think about the internet, it's sort of pre-mobile. We're in a pre-mobile stage. We're in a stage where I think the individuals who are using this technology are very much in that, we'll call it like that leader category. They're looking for trends. They're much like Yorke and myself, where they're naturally thinking of themselves as disruptors, and they're interested in that space. But I think it's still quite early. Now, what I would say is, people are starting to realize the value of some of the technologies here, and so they're starting to become part of the conversations at the boardroom level for a lot of large companies, where it's not just, oh, well, I happen to find this interesting website that helps me navigate to a new restaurant in my town that was really difficult to find before, but now it's like, I actually have to think about, like, what is my business going to do with this technology to either make us faster, run cheap, basically run more effectively or cheaper, or then help us attack new revenue streams. And that's when you start to see the glimmer in the eye around this particular technology. But I also think that's when, the .com boom really started to take off in a serious way. But I would say we're still really early.
It's definitely early. And I knew that in 2015 when I was getting in that I was probably earlier on this wave than I was on other waves that I've been involved in. But I think the interesting point that you made about some of the things, I'll come back to the sort of where are we in a second. But if you look at some of the problems in the world today, some of which AI exacerbates, things like data provenance, verifiability, entity resolution, entity ID, people identity, all, proof of human. All of these things are blockchain concepts, right? Zero knowledge proofs. How do I prove something without revealing the underlying data so that it doesn't get scarfed up by AI, right? There's so many concepts that the blockchain ecosystem has driven forward at a pace that's not been seen before in some of those areas, including like zero knowledge technology and encryption. And so that to me is just a fascinating lens. It's one of the most vibrant open source ecosystems in the world. I think that is different actually, right, than the early days of the web, right? We did not have this vibrant open source ecosystem as much as people in the pure TCP/IP web space wanted it to be decentralized and open, right? We didn't have that, right? Microsoft shipped Windows 95 in 1995, which was a seminal moment for consumers because now you had a TCP/IP stack and a browser, or multiple browsers, as the DOJ would like us to say, in the operating system in front of consumers, whether they cared or not. Right, and in some sense, in the past 5 years, for most consumers, that's where blockchain has been, right? Like consumers, it's here, right? It's not quite in every tech stack. Consumers generally really don't care, right? They don't know why they should care, right? And so I think we're somewhere, in the range of sort of pre-chasm almost crossing. There are moments, there are things that have happened where there's definitely crossing the chasm moments. But I think, it's so early.
Yeah, great, exciting. So I want to talk about, as I said, innovating within these large blue chip companies, these giant tech companies. What does it mean to evolve or transform a company from the inside versus what we might see at a founder-led company?
Yeah, so
Lot of meetings?
yeah, lot of meetings. I think I'll just sort of share what it looked like from my perspective. So as Leigh mentioned, I actually came into Google as a product lawyer. And when you're a product lawyer at these companies, you should think of yourself as like a little mini general counsel, right? So you're responsible for thinking about like, what are the legal risks here? How are we thinking about our strategy from a regulatory perspective? And then you're just thinking about risk generally. And it actually wires you to think probably how most senior executives at large, mature organizations think. They are wired, their boards are wired to think about risk first. Even though those board members are not lawyers and they're fantastic product people and they've built billion-dollar businesses, they're always thinking about that. And so for my own journey, what I realized in all the conversations, and by the way, there were dozens of people who pitched Sundar and Thomas about why we need to get into the crypto space generally. And what I saw as a common theme in every single one of those pitches is no one talked about the downside risk in an honest and straightforward way. And then no one talked about mitigating that risk for a company like Google. And so when you're thinking about this at these big companies, whether you're going to go work there or you work there today, the most important thing that I think folks can do is really think about how do I fix the downside risk for this organization in a way that allows them to reframe the attention around the upside opportunity. Because if you just start about upside opportunity, everyone's saying, yeah, but is this person going to drive this bus off a cliff?
Speculation.
It's all, yeah, and like how real is that opportunity? Is it speculative or not? And so for me, that was something that really kind of paired well with just the skill sets that I had just had by chance, and what I saw is the issue within Google internally.
So do you think that is what, let me drill it down into that, is that what has allowed you to unlock things and do things? Because you've done quite a bit. I used to work at Google. It's not an easy place to get, it's just an enormous place. You have, done a partnership with Kiln around staking, partnerships with EY and SAP to use Coinbase to accept crypto payments, partnership with CME. You've done stuff. Is that what you just said? Is that how you've been able to do it, by sharing the downside risk in a
having those conversations and actually helping those stakeholders understand those risks and being a partner to them in that. I mean, I think there's another point here, and I think Yorke and I've talked about this. Continuity is so key in these organizations. So like there's a very common thing in the crypto professional world where people are jumping around like 2 to 3 years here, 2 to 3 years here. And at a large organization, if you're doing that, every time that happens, there's a reset. And so I've been at Google now for 6 years. 4 of those years have been spent really driving, and it's not just me, there's several folks who have been in part of this journey, but really driving the same consistent messaging. So when I have a meeting with our treasury team or our finance team or someone on the product leadership team, they know, okay, I know who I'm talking to, I know the frame of reference they have, I understand that they've done 2 or 3 things that have maintained our credibility as an organization, we haven't bet the business, what's the next thing, and is there an opportunity here? And so now we're just building momentum, I think, and you guys may be in a similar spot from a momentum standpoint.
You said so many things that resonate. One, large entities with brand risk and revenue are by nature conservative, right? And so you have to approach it from how do I solve the downside risk problem, right, for people. I'll give you and the other thing is whenever you're dealing with new technology, you're dealing with people who have fear of new things, right? It's just a natural human behavior, not that it's technology, it's just fear of the new, right? Fear of change. And so the easiest reaction of people who have fear of something new is to tell you why it's bad in a sound bite, right? So that's all you hear is like, energy consumption, bad, meme coins, speculation, right? Like consumer retailers getting wrecked, right? And that's all noise until you actually have an evidence-based conversation, which is what Rich is describing that he was able to do. And I had to do something similar when we were doing our supply chain blockchain work, which is a massive cost of capital benefit to the corporation from what we did in our chips supply chain business and cloud. And using a public number here, that's more than $30 billion per year in spend. to keep growing, right, the cloud business. So that's data about the movement of those goods flowing across blockchain and getting detailed information from the state change information associated with where that stuff is, whose hands it is in, et cetera. And so that allowed us to do a cost of capital benefit through just-in-time funding. In order to get that into production, I had to go in front of a guy named who is our chief environmental officer, and his sustainability review board, or environmental review board, and prove through data that the infrastructure that we were putting in place from a blockchain perspective was not what everybody was scared of, right? The energy consumption of proof of work, which is what most people point to when they talk about that problem space. And at the time, actually, Ethereum was still running on proof of work, so we also had to differentiate what we were doing internally versus the public blockchain Ethereum. This is shortly before the merge. So we knew the merge was coming, so I could also show the difference on pre-merge, post-merge in terms of energy footprint. And all of that data, like nobody has done that before. In fact, there was nothing in the market where that was done before. And it involves going through what does a workload look like in a cloud infrastructure, in our case, obviously, and what is the footprint, the carbon footprint, and all of the other environmental impacts associated with those specific workloads running 24 hours a day, et cetera, and what does that net out to? And then how do you compare it to something that people understand? Like, what does it cost to charge a cell phone, which is one of the examples we did. And so creating evidence, and obviously also as an instructor at NYU, this is also a really important thing, is like you need to move people into an evidence-based conversation so you can have the real conversation.
Something you said reminded me of an anecdote about when Brian Chesky of Airbnb was first, had their idea. He went to one of his mentors and told him about the idea to share homes. And he said, I hope that's not the only thing you're working on. So just to the point of, dismissing or no, it's not going to work, that's crazy. The innovation is filled with examples of that.
You have to show people.
Yeah.
That's the thing that I've realized on the journey is like there's a bunch of papers out there. There's a lot of writing. I think even for myself, that we all have this bias that people can explain things to you, and you may grok it, you may get it, but it doesn't really motivate you to act until you see it, right? Like the thing that motivated me to act when I looked at crypto the first time was being able to send a payment on chain. And that was just really incredible. And then the next big moment for me was using Uniswap, right? The idea that you could buy a financialized asset without having to go through kind of the rigorous checks of Charles Schwab or whatever your brokerage account might be. That was amazing, right? And so I feel like we do a lot of evangelizing in the written form in crypto, but I think we need to do more of showing the value that we're talking about in a very real way that's real to the people that we're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, real case studies, right, are great examples. So that's so important, right? Mm-hmm.
Or seeing that your competitors are doing something. That's also a powerful thing, too. So maybe you guys can goad off each other.
I will certainly give it to Rich in this category.
But what is the general attitude of big tech, which I know is maybe a bad word, but toward this pocket of innovation in the market? How do they grapple with it? How do they react and respond? What is the attitude of big tech towards crypto and blockchain? What are they, and how has that evolved, maybe?
You want to take this first, or? Okay. Well, I think the attitude is obviously shifted. When I first joined the company, I think there was some cautious optimism from certain folks who had understood the technology and really thought it was interesting and aligned philosophically. I think most senior folks that I had interacted with were very cold towards it, right? It was very much, a reflection, I think, of what they were getting from the space, right? So they, blockchain and specifically Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies generally they represent a bit of financial nihilism, right? It's this idea that things do not work, the system is not functioning well, and that system in many ways involves every large incumbent. So if you're a big company and people say it doesn't work, it being the system, you kind of say, is this a criticism of me? And I think many folks thought that maybe this would be disruptive in the wrong kinds of ways for a large organization like Google or Google Cloud. That has shifted, though, as folks became more educated and understood that what most people will want is continued optionality. So there are, and I think everyone's seeing this today, there are versions of crypto products that are very much aligned with the crypto ethos of self-custody, holding your own private keys, not relying on intermediaries, all of that. We are now also seeing products that are built for what I would consider to be like mass adoption or adoption by large regulated entities that do involve KYC checks, that do involve some of these features that people want. Most people do not want to hold the essential equivalent of a security deposit box key in their wallet, and if they lose it, it's gone and they can't get access to it, the end. That's not the experience that most individuals want. And so when I think that became real, that idea that there was a spectrum of this technology, that it wasn't a take it or leave it bet, that's when the mind shift started to change. And it was, what can we do to accelerate this? We do a lot in open source. Blockchain is deeply open source, as Yorke mentioned earlier. So what can we do to facilitate open source development? What are the things that we can do to help solve collective action problems by virtue of our role in Google Cloud? And that became an opportunity for people to be open to learn more about it and then become less hostile.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point because we share the cloud provider role here. Cloud providers like workloads, right? Open source workloads actually on Azure and probably on Google too represent more than 50% of the workloads running in the cloud on any given day, right? And so blockchain's an open source workload. There's a vibrant community of open source development and workload going on, right? Like you should support that, right? From that perspective. There were I think another interesting data point, because institutions are about people, right, and not so much like they function independently of people. In a tech world, at least when I grew up in the tech space, and I know I have a lot of colleagues in the tech space who are engineers who haven't learned differently, but I made a very deliberate decision not to go to Wall Street when I was coming out of college as a computer science engineer, and a very deliberate decision to go into technology, and also to stay in New York. So that's why I'm still here. But a lot of computer scientists, or what I would consider myself at the time a purist, not necessarily for good reasons, but it's just the way I was sort of brought up, was like Wall Street, money, speculation, computer science, building, technology, changing things in the world. Those are two very different paths, right? And so there are many, many, many engineers, especially older school engineers in large tech companies, that can't see the convergence of digital value on top of technology. They just can't get over it, right? And this is just, those people will leave or they'll be proven wrong, right? And so that's one really important thing to realize about technology. You guys have this amazing benefit that you're in a world where you never saw that difference, right? You never saw what it was like to be on an internet versus not. Those are important differences that you bring to the value of your role in a large corporation as well.
As crypto moves into the mainstream, and as we see that happening, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, what do you think crypto's inventors would make of these, of it being adapted at Google and Microsoft? What do you think Satoshi would think of these technologies being at these enormous companies? And I'll just pause and say, I don't know if people know about this book, The Mysterious Mr. Nakamoto. It just came out last month. A friend of mine wrote it, so that's my Satoshi reference there. But either one of you take that one.
So on my way over on the subway, I was working on Copilot on my phone, which is Microsoft's cloud implementation of many different open source AI models. It is the consumer experience, right? Similar to what Google has. So I created a podcast, and then the podcast was Rich, myself, Vitalik, and Satoshi. And just like going through like, what are the questions, what would you ask, how would you set this up? And then I also pivoted it to having Satoshi be the moderator as well. So the convergence of technology actually I think is really interesting. And I don't necessarily think that Satoshi would be unhappy actually with what's happening. Now, clearly I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist on the other side of that, right? Which I think a lot of folks in that category would think, well, what are we doing here? But more as a technology pragmatist who sees value in how technology is adopted on a mass scale, which is one of the reasons why you work at a Google or a Microsoft, is that's what you want to see, right? The only way we get there is with convergence, right? And getting things into the hands of consumers who know nothing about the underlying ethos of the technology.
Yeah, part of me wonders if Satoshi would even care, right? The white paper is about building a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. It's not building a peer-to-peer electronic cash system only for individuals and not corporations or other people. And so I think in many ways there's a lot of
Great point, by the way. One of the most earliest successes there is M-Pesa.
Right, and it's exactly right, and that in that context, right, like B2B payments becomes really interesting, and there's a lot of value here for others, and I don't necessarily view the individual or the group of people that would have written a white paper like that to be particularly dogmatic about how that technology comes into the world and changes people's lives, right? In many ways, it's freedom maximizing technology, much similarly to the way the internet was. And the people who started the early internet probably had a view about what it would look like and what it should look like.
They definitely did.
And ultimately, it probably differed from what the internet looks like today. But I don't think anybody in the room would say like, oh, I'd actually take the 2005 dogmatic viewpoint of what the internet should look like. I'll swap that out for what I have today.
In fact, Tim Berners-Lee, one of the founding fathers of the internet, says one of his main mistakes was not building identity and ownership of identity into the internet. I mean, that is a clear vision of where we all obviously believe we should be going.
Wow. Switching gears a little bit, what do each of you think is the logical geographic epicenter or ecosystem for Web3? Do you think it'll ultimately revolve around capital markets like New York and London? Or will Singapore or Dubai take the crown? What's the natural home of crypto and Web3? Is it New York? Is New York Web3 Silicon Valley, and is this the Stanford?
How can you let any
Cornell Tech.
Knicks fans in the house? Anybody watching Knicks last night? Come on, guys, this is not the Knicks crew here? How can that be?
Couple, just a couple.
I mean, listen, there's only so many epicenters of the world. So and by the way, I think all of those are actually interesting. I chose to spend my whole career here for a reason, and I'm still happy to be here. So.
It's not Austin where I live today. I definitely think New York is certainly one of those. I wonder if it will matter as much, just because the value of this technology is that it is borderless in many ways. So I think you do have these sort of capital markets infrastructure pillars that are in New York or in these big cities that naturally, as blockchain empowers those folks, they may create a center of gravity. But ultimately, I would say, yeah, I think New York is probably.
So I do agree with you. Three or four differences that make that a different question today. One is cloud. Right, and things like Airbnb, for example, would not exist today in the way that it exists without cloud, nor would Uber and other things like that, right? The other is decentralization and borderless technology, right? I think those things change what you can do and where you do it. And then obviously all of the tools that we have today, and especially the habits that we have in the startup ecosystem of remote and hybrid working environments. What is actually fascinating to me, by the way, in that point, is if you look at the trend of millennials, 20-somethings, whatever you want to call them, starting in the pandemic, there was this influx into New York of this young population. And I think that was sort of people like working remote, yes, but they like to be able to convene in person. And this is an epicenter of a lot of vibrant activity, and I think it will continue to be.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question. By the way, payments is another reason why Airbnb took off. Online payments were right where they needed to be at the moment Airbnb took off. I think that's something that oftentimes is lost in the Airbnb kind of explosion story. Last question. What is your view on how tied AI and crypto will be?
So the point that I talk about when we think about AI and crypto is maybe a couple things. One is when we think about payments, so you kind of took the lead there, and it's actually a really good point, which is most of these on-chain payments will probably be happening with agentic AI models, right? And so there are already people experimenting with this in the crypto space, and the reason is pretty simple. you cannot connect an agentic model to a bank and have it move money. It's very difficult to do that because you have multiple parties you have to interact with. The bank has to agree to give you access to the APIs. It's a whole thing. Whereas in the crypto space, the idea of self-custody really kind of unleashes a lot of opportunity there. I think like if you were to, the mental model I have for AI and crypto is sort of the mental model that Leigh has for payments and Airbnb, or the one that I have for Uber and mobile. So like we had the internet before we had Uber. We did not have Uber. Why not? Most people don't think about calling a taxi from the desktop. And it was the idea that I have the ability to get on the internet now while I stand on a street corner, and that all of a sudden I can now call this taxi from here. And that's actually just created a totally different consumer experience by virtue of two technologies coming together at the right time. Whether it's identity or payments or those things, I actually think that's the power of AI and crypto. And I don't want to even pontificate about what I think that will look like, because that would imply that I could invent the next Uber. And I think that's very, very difficult. But I do see the impact of that being very similar and really sort of systemic.
I'll say a couple of things. One, yes, and so a couple of things. We are definitely in the read, write, infer era, right? Or read, write, own, and infer, right? Chris Dixon wrote the book of Read, Write, Own. I added infer to that because that's where we are, right? You cannot ignore this technology, AI specifically. So if you're not spending time working with AI, you're doing yourself a massive disservice. I know people who are probably coders are doing it just naturally, whether it's in Cursor or VS Code or whatever, because there are built-in copilots in those codes. And that at minimum is like a 20% productivity jump, right? Whatever you're doing. I'll give you one data point really quickly. So a couple weeks ago, I was, I work a full-time job. I teach at NYU. I was at NIST in Gaithersburg, Maryland for a full week of standards meetings, right, on top of my full-time job and my teaching, right? I'm like, this is really bad. Like, I was already going in with a very bad feeling about how that week was going to go, because we're also shipping product internally in the work that I'm doing. And while I was there, I was taking notes, right, just diligently so that I could report back what was going on. And at the end of the conference, I realized that I had written 30 pages of notes, which is ridiculous and crazy, that nobody will probably read, but AI could summarize. But I also wrote 2 papers while I was there based on what I learned at the event. And I could not have done that without AI. And that, to me, was a demonstration of the power of this technology. Massive, massive productivity increases for people. You have to be on this the same way your parents were leaning into the PC or to the internet, right, or to mobile, right? If you weren't, if you were like me and you were stuck on a BlackBerry with a non-touch screen as long as you could possibly be because you liked the keyboard, and you didn't get on touch screen, you were behind, right? And so you have to be at the forefront of this technology, especially as you're starting your career, and it's a superpower, right? You can run circles around people. So how does that intersect with crypto? AI utility will be in everything, to Rich's point. Great examples of agentic workloads that are authorized on behalf of someone or an institution to do certain things with limits, like payments, for example, is one example of that. And there's going to be so many more of those examples. Your digital twin, right, can be authorized by you, right, as to act on behalf of you, right, and in the context of an agentic avatar, for example, or something else. I will say one other thing, because like in these events, I know we talk a lot about value. Cryptocurrencies are tokens that have any number of parameters and characteristics associated with them. Only one of those is value. And that is the most boring as shit thing that we have in the cryptocurrency ecosystem, because today we have dollars, right? Like, yes, it replicates in a digital form and makes it more accessible and more liquid, et cetera, but please go beyond talking just about the value of a token, because there's so many more interesting things that you can do.
That's a great place to leave us. And I want to thank you both for your time and your incredible insights today. Please join me in thanking Rich and Yorke for being here in their conversation.
Thank you.